Good afternoon. I prepared for this talk by reading it to my children. If you have children who have a hard time falling asleep, please feel free to email me and I will be happy to share my paper with you. The person and theology of St. Gregory Palamas achieved a remarkable popularity in the 20th century. A once esoteric figure in an overlooked period of Byzantine ecclesiastical history, Palamas has become, thanks primarily to the efforts of Vladimir Losky and Father John Meyendorff, something of a household name, at least for those of us in this room. Particularly in the context of systematic and ecumenical theology, Palamas has come to be included among the landmark voices of a variegated and diverse Christian tradition. Richard Hanson lists him alongside not only John of Damascus, but Augustine, Aquinas, Calvin, Karl Barth, and Karl Rahner. His status is such that he's received attention from figures such as Catherine LaCugna, Robert Jensen, Bruce McCormick, Wolfhard Pannenberg, and of course, Rowan Williams and John Milbank. Yet this coup in the promotion and popular reception of Palamas, welcome as it has been for Orthodox Christians, is not without its drawbacks for a deep, contextualized understanding of Palamite theology. Though scholars have brought greater and greater attention to bear on this once neglected father of the church and his distinction between God's essence and energies, they've also tended to treat him, like many great thinkers, in almost total isolation. When we encounter the name of Palamas in secondary literature, be it in the work of systematicians and ecumenists, or in the historical theological research of more specialized scholars, it tends to stand alone. Though the earliest scholars of Palamism, researchers like Jugy and Kandal, and even Uspensky, took an active interest in the entire panoply of Palamite and anti-Palamite authors, modern students of Palamas have not usually shown the same interest. Father John Meyendorff, in his 1959 Introduction, had taken pains to include a wide discussion of Gregory's polemical context, touching on his collaborators, his sympathizers, and opponents in the 14th century. In his work, we encounter not only Palamas himself and the well-known Barlaam, but other critical figures of the Palamite controversy: David Disipatos, Mark Kyrtos, Joseph Kalothetos, Dorotheos Vlatis, Matthew Vlastaris, Philotheos Kokinos, Isidore Vouchiras, Athanasios of Kyzikos, and many others. Yet very few of these supporting characters have attracted the attention of people in theology in the decades since, save for a number of specialized studies that remain far from the mainstream. When scholars have taken an interest in other Palamites, it has usually been to compare and contrast them with Palamas himself. This pattern begins already with Martin Jugy, whose analysis of Palamite authors like Theophanes of Nicaea and John Cantacuzénos features commentary on their adherence to Palamas, measuring a given writer's distinction between essence and energies by its fidelity to Palamas. In his survey, he would generally affirm the credentials of the late Byzantine Palamites, taking exception only with Gennadios Scholarius, whom he famously marked out as the starting point of a Palamism mitigé, a mitigated Palamism, that would continue to develop over subsequent centuries of Orthodox Church history. More recently, John Dimitrokopoulos, whose influence I think is apparent in today's workshop, has come up several times, has extended the charge of Palamism mitigé to nearly all of Gregory's immediate followers. He actually refers to this as Neo-Palamism. He homes in specifically on the notion of opinia as a dividing line between Palamas and his would-be supporters, as we've heard several times. These latter are said to have softened Gregory's real distinction between essence and energies into a conceptual or subjective distinction. But in both of these approaches to the broader circle of Palamite authors, that of total neglect and that of reductive comparison, the assumption is the same. The writings and thought of St. Gregory Palamas form a more or less complete and closed system, a freestanding monolith of theological reflection. On the one hand, this allows the work of Palamas to be treated in a vacuum, whether by systematicians or even by us students of the essence-energies distinction. On the other hand, when the work of fellow Palamites is deemed worthy of engagement, their thought and writings are treated as if they bear no intrinsic relationship to the thought of Palamas himself. Instead, what we witness is the mere juxtaposition of Palamas and his putative supporters. Gregory functions as something of a standard or rule against which his followers are measured. Their work is mined for parallels, similarities, influence, and especially the divergences that have captivated scholars. But seldom are Palamite texts seen as an extension and integral part of Palamas' own efforts on behalf of the essence-energies distinction. So my suggestion this afternoon is that this approach to texts, to the comparison of texts, is fundamentally misguided. If we are attentive to the historical dimension of the Palamite controversy and to the specifics of how the essence-energies distinction was actually worked out, defended, and canonized, we find that it ultimately makes little sense to treat Palamite authors in hermetic isolation, bringing them together only to compare and contrast them with one another and with the work of Palamas. Whether we've been taught to do this by conceiving of late Byzantine theology as an academic or scholastic endeavor, and I don't use the word pejoratively, but merely referring to the methodology, in which a thinker worked out his ideas in relative isolation, or whether we have simply become accustomed to engaging theological texts as autonomous fragments. The reality of the Palamite controversy was that different Palamite authors do not actually represent a series of independent voices and contributions. Between the outbreak of the Hesychast controversy in 1337 or 1338 and the death of Palamas 20 years later, what we witness is the growth and development of a veritable school, a corporate collaborative endeavor to articulate and defend what we've come to know as Palamite theology, ultimately culminating in a series of synodal, magisterial pronouncements that transcend the writings of a single author. And if we are attentive to the dynamic of collaboration and to the historical cooperation of Gregory's friends and supporters, we arrive at a very different understanding of the diversity and nuance that existed in the circle of Palamas. So essentially my paper is a footnote to Marius's paper, supporting his thesis. In place of mitigation, infidelity, and departure, what we actually see is complexity, complementarity, and interdependence. In other words, by replacing the current compare and contrast model with a hermeneutic that is grounded in the historical relationships between our many authors, we're able to interpret this very richness and diversity in Palamite theology more fruitfully and more sensitively, without necessarily flattening the rich landscape of our different authors and their thought. Now, it is by no means difficult to justify the picture of a Palamite school and a broad Palamite cooperation. Scholars have long spoken of the Palamite movement and an active circle of partisans that grew up around Palamas. As we have already noted, Palamas himself wrote not in the detached calm of a scholastic or academic environment. This was no cool intellectual exchange of ideas between himself, Varlam, Athos, and Gregoras. Rather, what we see in the second quarter of the 14th century is an all-out war that absorbed a great part of the Byzantine Empire for 30 years, and in fact beyond. Much was at stake, and the respective parties wasted no time in consolidating their base and agitating for rapid reform and consequences. As Akindinos would point out in his letter to Nicholas Kavaslas, one had to take sides and act. It was unconscionable to sit idly by in this momentous battle between good and evil, or rather, between traditional Orthodox Christianity and polytheism. The blows in the controversy were cast not only with the pen, but with substantive action brought against the offending party. Beginning with Varlam's accusation of the Hesychast before the Patriarch and the Synod, the Palamite controversy would unfold in a series of large-scale actions taken by one side and then another. Not content to write theological treatises, Palamas quickly rallied the support of the Athonite monasteries, producing the Hagiretic tome of 1340 as a first ecclesial response to the heresies of Varlam. Throughout his career, he would continue to invoke this source of support as validation of his orthodoxy. As he was wont to say, it cannot be that the entire Holy Mountain is wrong. Much like today, the witness of the Holy Mountain was seen as a kind of seal of orthodoxy. And in Gregory's rhetoric, there is a real sense that one cannot go against Athos without going against the church itself. The Patriarch John Kalekas and the court at Constantinople seem to recognize this fact. Professor Antonio Rigo has provided us with a lucid analysis of the battle for Athos that unfolded between Kalekas and Palamas. Although we now lack much of the correspondence between Athos, Kalekas, and the Empress Anna, we know that the support of the Holy Mountain was the object of a great struggle in this period. This is vividly evidenced in the epistolary of Palamas himself, particularly his letters to Macarius of the Great Lavra, the elders of the Holy Mountain, and of course the future patriarch Philotheos. Ultimately, of course, the leading Athenites of the time are on Palamas' side, and they engage in an active campaign to vindicate his theology. For Palamas, this support is invaluable, and he rarely lets his opponents forget that he has it. In his refutation of the letter of John Kalekas, when the latter was still considered the leader of the Palamite delusion, as Palamas puts it, Palamas also claims to have the support of the monks in Thessalonica. The empire's second city was an important source of support for Palamas. In addition to its monasteries, it was home to a number of prominent Palamites, including the future patriarch Isidore Voukiras and the brothers Dorotheos and Mark Vlatis, founders, of course, of the Vlatadon monastery. To say that the Palamite controversy was essentially a partisan affair comes as no great shock. Like many events in the life of the Byzantine Empire, the Palamite controversy gave an occasion for the formation of rigid factions and alliances. Bound up with the politics of the time, specifically the civil war between the house of the Paleologoi and John VI Cantacuzene, the theological controversy in many ways mirrored the vicissitudes of the imperial throne, even if the theological alliances do not line up neatly with political camps. As a polemicist, Palamas himself worked not alone, but as a member of one of these parties. Indeed, the suggestion of a Palamite school goes back to the time of the controversy itself. If one reads the polemical literature of the period, both Palamite and anti-Palamite, it is exceedingly common to see the two sides of the controversy referred to precisely in terms of a party or a faction. Palamas speaks of Akindinos and all who follow him, or Akindinos and those who think like him. Usually these labels are derisive, as when Palamas refers to the Simoria of Akindinos, or the ignoble Fratria of Varlam. The communion of the heretics is contrasted with the Ecclesia of the Orthodox, the latter constituting the authentic church by their adherence to the true faith. But the name-calling, of course, is reciprocal. We're all aware of the term Nouvelle Théologienne, Neoi Theologoi, applied by Akindinos to the Palamites. Nikephoros Gregoras likewise speaks of the Palamites as a faction, again, a fratria, and even a drinking club, to be etymological about the term. Palamas, in other words, is said to be a leader not of the church, but of a clique and a sect. This derogatory language speaks to the corporate character of all the theologies of the time. In the case of many figures like Nikephoros Gregoras, we can speak of specific disciples, like Isaac Argyros. But the awareness that what we call Palamism in particular was not the doctrine of a single man, but the common teaching of a large body of supporters, is everywhere evinced in the writings of Palamas himself and forms an important part of his rhetoric, particularly in the 1340s, during his struggle with John Kalekas, but also in his later writings against Gregoras. Palamas is wont to speak of himself, quote, and all those who harmonize with him ensure piety, or Palamas together with all who are like-minded, metapandon ton homophronundon, as well as Palamas and all those with him. The language of a party, in other words, is not just derisive. And it is difficult to see, and is not difficult to see, why Palamas would not single himself out as the lone architect of an essence-energies distinction. Though his opponents like to speak of the Palamite dogma, or the doctrine of Palamas, Gregory is insistent that the doctrine is not his, but that of the whole church. To use his favorite expression, it is the common piety of Christians, and not just in a historical sense. All of these facts speak to the reality that with Palamism, we are dealing with more than just a single author, however influential and central he may have been. Many of the collaborators of St. Gregory Palamas have already been mentioned above. They include, within his lifetime, David Disipatos, Mark Kyrtos, Joseph Kalothetos, Matthew Vlaskalis, Philotheos Kokinos, Isidore Bouchiras, Nilos Kavasilas, and Patriarch Callistos I. All of these composed treatises which parallel the labors of Palamas. They wrote against Varlam, Akindinos, and Gregoras contemporaneously with St. Gregory. All of these facts, but where the communal aspect of the essence-energies distinction really comes to the fore is not in the bare fact of multiple Palamite authors by itself, but in the synods that vindicate Palamism and secure, albeit only gradually, the victory of the Palamite party. As we've already noted, the Palamite controversy proceeded not as a dispassionate exchange of ideas, but as a violent struggle to quash heresy explicitly and definitively. Unlike today, perhaps, and contrary to how we sometimes conceive of church history, things moved very quickly from Varlam's initial complaints and the production of the Hagioretic Tome to a full-fledged synod, receiving comprehensive adjudication in the presence of the hierarchy and the Emperor Andronicus III, who of course preceded the partisan politics of later years. The Synod of 1341 condemned Varlam and his blasphemies against the monks in the light of the Transfiguration, and although Patriarch John Kalekas would later qualify its vindication of the most honorable hieromonk Kyr Gregory Palamas, the tome of 1341 itself, composed after the death of Andronicus, indeed bore witness to Palamas, as he would put it some years later. Most importantly for Palamas, it not only lent the authority of the emperor, of both emperors, Andronicus and later Cantacuzene, as well as Kalekas himself, to Gregory's doctrine, it effectively enrolled them in the very authorship of what we now call Palamite theology. Here thinking specifically of the tomos. I know that's a charged word these days, but forgive me. From that point forward, Gregory says that to call Gregory's doctrine heretical is to call the emperor himself, his judges, and his officials heretics. Kalekas' change of heart and subsequent persecution of Palamas is well known. For our purposes, it is enough to note that his efforts against Palamas have a much wider scope. Not only did he imprison Palamas, he also imprisoned Dorotheos. Additionally, he declines to confirm the election of Isidore as Archbishop of Monemvasia. In this period, the Akindanist Hyacinth was made Archbishop of Corinth and then Thessalonica. Finally, on November 4th, 1344, not only was Palamas excommunicated, but Isidore, who would eventually lead the Palamite takeover of the hierarchy, was deposed. Kalekas' machinations, as we know, include his eventual ordination of Akindinos. And these machinations would definitively turn the Empress Anna against him. At the end of 1345 and at the beginning of 1346, she begins to compile her own dossier on the controversy. She seeks written testimonies not only from Palamas and Akindinos, but from David Disipatos and Philotheos Kokinos as well. Eventually, Kalekas is excommunicated, and at this point, more bishops append their signatures to the Tomos of 1341. I'm being told that I have 2 minutes, so I have to, unfortunately, skip ahead, much as you are craving the details of Palamite collaboration. So, having looked at the corporate character of the Palamite movement, and I think you get the point, we turn now to the different treatises of Palamite authors on the essence-energies distinction. As Dimitriopoulos has noted, and as a perusal of the documents shows, these texts and their authors do not limit themselves to parroting Palamas. They use language, expression, and concepts which Palamas does not use, not only in the use of epimia, but also, at least in early texts, in the use of theotides, in the plural, divinities, which Palamas does not explicitly embrace. They exhibit a creativity and freedom in defending and describing the essence-energies distinction, and can be seen to explicitly go beyond Palamas himself. But without entering into the details of the entire pro-Palamite corpus, we can now return to my original point. What does this diversity among Palamite authors and their writings mean, and how do we interpret it? One question that Dimitriopoulos does not ask, and it seems an obvious one, is what was Gregory's reaction to this diversity? Many of the authors that Dimitriopoulos examines in his article Palamas Transformed were contemporaries of Palamas. Even if we ignore the dramatic extent to which the Palamites were part of a cohesive and collaborative movement, we must ask, why does Palamas not respond to his followers' unique formulations? When Disipatos and Vastaris decide to quote the Epimia passages in Basil, which Palamas seems to have taken pains to avoid, what is Gregory's reaction? We have no evidence of correctives, tacit or otherwise. We have no evidence of repudiation. Many of these authors were not only Palamites, in a general sense, they were disciples of Palamas. If we were to posit an explicit softening of Palamas' doctrine within his own lifetime, wouldn't we need to account for what this means for the relationship between Gregory and his followers? More directly, the theology of Nilos and Kokinos, as Marius brought up, is said to push somewhat against Palamas' doctrine, specifically in the Tomos of 1351. In this document, the distinction between essence and energies, or rather their separation, is said to be by thought, logismo. Certainly, this is a qualification that does not appear verbatim or explicitly in Palamas' own writings. But can we really forget that Palamas signed the Tomos of 1351? Does it make sense to pit this text against Gregory's original writings when it is not only validated by his signature, but praised and affirmed in his later apologetic writings against Guyaras? This is not just tacit approval now, evidenced by a lack of correctives or repudiation. Now we are talking about explicit endorsement. And I think this is a case in point for re-examining the way we look at Palamite texts beyond the writings of Palamas. To conclude, it seems obvious that Palamite theology need not be limited to the formulations of Palamas himself. Diversity is not necessarily contradiction or mitigation. What we see is not necessarily tension or infidelity, but simply difference. What this difference means is, of course, open to debate. One way of looking at it is as development. Another is as mere complementarity. Once we question the presumption that difference equals divergence, the hermeneutical horizon opens up before us. Significantly, this has consequences also for later Palamites as well, even those who wrote after Palamas and did not work with him. If the confreres and collaborators of Palamas are able to admit a variety of expressions and illustrations, then it is not impossible that later devotees would likewise exhibit an essential fidelity to the Hesychast doctor without necessarily being limited to his words. Thank you very much.